All right, the Fort Pillow Massacre. Let's talk about that. The Fort Pillow Massacre goes down as the worst example of wartime atrocities during the Civil War, bar none. Fort Pillow initially was a fort that belonged to the Confederacy, but was captured by Union troops in 1862. In March of 1864, Confederate Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest launched a cavalry raid in western Tennessee and Kentucky that was designed to disrupt Union supply lines and to capture Union prisoners. In early April, he determined to move on Fort Pillow, located 40 miles north of Memphis. Around 600 Union troops, half of them black, held the fort. On April the 12th, Forrest's men easily captured the fort. Most of the Union soldiers dropped their muskets, threw their hands up in the universal sign of surrender, and instead of taking them prisoner, according to the rules of war, Confederate troops murdered the Union troops in cold blood, the majority of whom were black soldiers. While Southerners still dispute this account, eyewitnesses and written accounts substantiate what happened that day. Several official inquiries have been made into the massacre. And let me go back one slide. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of War concluded that the Union troops were shot after they had surrendered. Historian Albert Castell came to the same conclusion. Another historian, Andrew Ward, also concluded that a massacre did indeed take place, but he absolved General Forrest of overall responsibility. So let's see what Forrest himself has to say. Forrest seemed pretty proud of what had occurred. His report is fairly clear that his men did indeed slaughter, those are his words, slaughter Union forces. After the war, a society was established in Pulaski, Tennessee, by 6 former Confederate officers, and that society was known as the Ku Klux Klan, the Invisible Empire, as it was called. And the Ku Klux Klan perpetrated unspeakable acts of terrorism and cruelty on blacks, Jews, and really anyone who they deemed racially inferior or who was opposed to the Democratic Party. Forrest became the Klan's first Grand Wizard, but an interesting testimony, Forrest was gloriously saved in 1875 after hearing Reverend George Steinbach preach from Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 27. Forrest had been asked by his wife several times to go to church with her, and he would always refuse. And finally he relented. And as he sat next to his wife at the Court Avenue Presbyterian Church in Memphis, his heart was crushed, his spiritual eyes were opened, and the final 2 years of his life were devoted to reversing his past. He spoke at Black Civil Rights Groups meetings, and at the end of a speech at one, a young black girl presented Forrest with a bouquet of flowers as a sign of reconciliation between the two races, and Forrest accepted the flowers, and then he leaned down gently, kissed the little girl on the cheek. A public act of reverence and respect that was absolutely unheard of for a white man to do back then. He truly was a new creature in Christ Jesus. Forrest died in 1877, 2 years after he got saved from complications associated with diabetes at the age of 56. And sadly, today, he's remembered not for his conversion to Christ, but rather for his sin and the recent efforts from civil rights leaders to have his name and his statue taken down and erased from public consciousness is just indicative of a refusal to remain willfully ignorant just to support a political platform. We're now going to conclude Module 5 by examining Grant's Overland Campaign. And now that campaign included several battles, but we are just going to focus on two main ones for this course. And those are the Battle of the Wilderness and the Battle for Spotsylvania Courthouse. Now there's a plethora of books on Grant's Overland Campaign. I've read several myself. Two of the best that I've personally read are Joseph Whelan's Bloody Spring, 40 Days That Sealed the Confederacy's Fate, and another one by Gordon Ray, spelled R-H-E-A, Gordon Ray, entitled The Battles for Spotsylvania Courthouse and the Road to Yellow Tavern, May the 7th through the 12th, 1864. I highly recommend these if you want more information on this period of history, this period of Civil War. The Overland Campaign was Grant's master scheme to put an end to the seesaw stalemate in the Eastern Theater that had been going back and forth since really the war had begun in 1861. The Overland Campaign was basically a 6-week-long slugfest that ushered in a previously unseen and horrible brand of warfare that was new to the Civil War. Grant designed a multi-theater offensive that sent General Sherman into Georgia, General Banks to the Red River, General Franz Sigel into the Shenandoah, and General Butler, who we talked about earlier, up the Virginia Peninsula toward Richmond. So it was called Overland because that was the north-south approach that Grant took towards Richmond versus the roundabout peninsula approach that McClellan had attempted 2 years earlier. Now, aside from its legacy as the most horrific fighting of the war, the Overland Campaign drew out the innate schoolhouse strategies of both Grant and Lee. For Grant, the Overland Campaign represented the opportune moment to annihilate his opponent, a very Clausewitzian approach of using concentration and mass to smash the enemy into impotence. For Lee, on the other hand, the Overland Campaign represented Lee's intention to hit Grant quickly with everything he had and send the Yankees reeling back across the Rapidan River. So it was a classic case of the Napoleonic decisive battle, if you will, for Lee. Ironically, both sides ended up acting very much alike in how the campaign ended up playing out as each tried to outmaneuver and annihilate the other. By early June, the carnage would surpass anything seen during the war's previous 3 years. Lee and Grant would match wits across the dense woods and swamps and fields of Northern Virginia during 40 unprecedented days of really nearly ceaseless combat. This would be something new in Western warfare. And what I mean by new is daily fighting and massive troop movements punctuated by spasms of extreme bloodletting, something that had not been seen before in the annals of warfare in America. And because the battles closely followed one another, the battlegrounds of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor, North Anna, they would not lodge as deeply in the collective memory as had battles like Gettysburg, Chancellorsville, Shiloh, Fredericksburg, Antietam. And as terrible as they were, the battlefields of Grant's Overland Campaign would remain relatively unknown. The clash of these men and their armies would father two strategic innovations: the continuous offensive campaign of attrition and the use of defensive fortifications. Let me say that again. The Overland Campaign would result in the innovation of the continuous campaign of attrition warfare, and the use of defensive fortifications as a force multiplier. These would become hard and fast strategic and tactical tenets during the Great War that would be fought 50 years later. Grant's army won no battles during the Overland Campaign, but he won the overall campaign. Indeed, he, of course, won the war. And how did he do that? By never turning back and by using his overwhelming advantages in manpower, war material, resources to grind down Lee's army, something that none of his predecessors had been able to do or had even attempted, frankly. If you haven't already watched it, I recommend highly that you watch the Overland Campaign video that you can access through Canvas as part of this week. It'll really explain it, and it's animated. It's very well done. It's about 15 minutes long. Great visual representation, complete with Civil War reenactors, animated maps that'll really help you understand the nature of the Overland Campaign. Now, when studying any military battle, it's vital to understand the cast of characters, if you will, namely the lead commanders. While the average infantryman does the fighting and the dying in battle, it's the officers who get the credit and the mention in history books. Ultimately, everything rises and falls on leadership. Occasionally, you'll find a low-ranking private that'll get mentioned in some history book, but usually it's because that individual distinguished himself in some manner. So with that said, the main leaders during the Overland Campaign that we want to meet, get to know, are for the Union, of course, on the left there, General Ulysses Simpson Grant, who masterminded the entire campaign. He was by this time had been appointed by Lincoln General-in-Chief over all Union Army forces. General George Gordon Meade, to the right, was next in line as commander of the Army of the Potomac. General Winfield Scott Hancock commanded the 2nd Corps. He was from Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. In the middle there, we have General Governor Kemble Warren. His first name was Governor. Governor Kemble Warren commanded the Union 5th Corps. Warren was from Cold Spring, New York. He was a West Point grad. He is best known for organizing this last-minute defense of Little Round Top during the Battle of Gettysburg. And then we have General John Sedgwick, who commanded the U.S. 6th Corps. In addition to the 3 large infantry corps of the Union, we have General Ambrose Burnside, who commanded the detached U.S. 9th Corps, and General Philip Sheridan, who commanded the Cavalry Corps, the horse soldiers of the Potomac. On the Confederate side, of course, on the left there is General Robert E. Lee, General-in-Chief, so he's Grant's equivalent over the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee also had James Longstreet's 1st Corps. General Longstreet commanded the 1st Corps, as you see him in the middle there, comprised about 10,000 men, located about 42 miles from the rest of Lee's army, and it would be a full 2 days before Longstreet could arrive. Longstreet would be replaced by General Anderson after the Battle of the Wilderness due to being wounded in the neck. And then on the right, we have General Richard S. Ewell, who commanded the 2nd Corps, which comprised about 17,000 Confederate soldiers. Ewell was from Georgetown, D.C., was a Mexican War veteran, and a West Point grad as well. Also, for the Confederacy, General John Brown Gordon, J.B. Gordon, commanded a brigade of Georgia soldiers, staunchly against Reconstruction after the war. Gordon goes on to become a U.S. Senator. And then General A.P. Hill commanded the 3rd Corps, comprising about 15,000 men. Hill was from Culpeper, Virginia, and like most of the other men, Hill served in the Mexican War and was also a West Point graduate. Now, maps are extremely valuable when studying famous battles, and you really aren't going to find many history books, military history books, especially about specific battles, that are not going to contain a map or two, at least. So it would behoove you to kind of get familiar with learning how to read or study maps when it comes to military history. They're extremely valuable, so I want to provide a little bit of instruction on how to study this map of the Wilderness Battle, the first of 2 battles that we're going to talk about today. The first thing to note is there's a color variance, and so hopefully you can make that out on your screen, whatever electronic device you're using. But while not all battle maps are in color, it helps to distinguish the different opposing forces that are. So the red here on the map represents the Confederacy, and you can see on the top right corner there's a little legend that's given there. Red represents the Confederacy, blue represents the Union. The capitalized names that you see on the map stand for the respective commanders for each side and their relative positions on the map. So if you were to look up a prominent geographic feature from this battle on, say, Google Maps, and then kind of zoom out, you would discover that this area is really right off of modern-day Interstate 95 that's just east of the Potomac River. I want you to also notice these rectangular blocks that are strewn throughout the map, all over the map, really. These rectangular blocks represent infantry formations, numbering about 4,000 to 5,000 men each for each rectangle. So if you look at the sort of the top left and you find in the blue Sedgwick's name, of course, I already told you Sedgwick commanded the 6th Corps, so you'll see the Roman numeral 6 underneath of his name. You'll notice that when you count those rectangles up, he had roughly, his corps represented around 24,000 men in the 6th Corps. The lightly shaded green areas on the map represent the thick forests of Virginia in 1864. So detailed maps are vital really to understanding battles, and a good map can either make or break a historical book. Regarding the initial actions of the Battle of the Wilderness, we're just going to kind of go chronologically here. General Grant ordered General Meade to take the Army of the Potomac, cross the Rapidan River on about May 3rd or 4th 1864, at an area called Germanna and Ely Ford. And to some Union troops, this crossing would seem sort of like a deja vu to them because they had crossed that very spot a year prior, almost to the day, to fight Lee and Stonewall Jackson during the Battle of Chancellorsville. So the battlefield of the Wilderness is very similar to the exact location where Chancellorsville was fought. Behind the U.S. Union 2nd, 5th, and 6th Corps were Burnside's 9th Corps, all of which crossed the Rapidan using a total of about 5 pontoon bridges. Now, standing between Grant's massive 120,000-man force and the Confederate capital of Richmond was this area called the Wilderness, where few fields and roads broke up the unyielding density of its thickets, its woods, its tangled undergrowth, and in some areas the forest was so thick that the sun barely penetrated the treetops, which kind of basked the entire area in this eerie kind of a twilight thing. Very spooky. After the Army of the Potomac had crossed the Rapidan, they committed a grave tactical error. They entered the Wilderness, and then they stopped. While many high-ranking officers had fought at Chancellorsville a year earlier, they were well aware of the perils of operating in the Wilderness. The green canopy, the thick forest, and so the Army stopped its march on May the 4th over a decision on where to have the wagon trains move in relation to the Army. A very foolish decision. And as a result of this halt, Grant and Meade basically handed Lee a golden opportunity to strike them as the Army was all together, still inside this claustrophobic wilderness, a place that would nullify Meade's overwhelming advantages in numbers and cannon. Because cannons don't work well if they're stuck in the middle of a thick forest. While the Army of the Potomac was kind of high-fiving each other over their unopposed river crossing, Lee was setting his troops on a collision course with Grant's right flank, formed by Warren and Sedgwick's corps. Lee simultaneously ordered General Ewell's 2nd Confederate Corps to march east along a place called the Orange Turnpike, and his 3rd Corps, A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps, was to advance parallel to Ewell's Corps along a mile to the south on this road called the Orange Plank. So these two roads, and you'll see this on the next map, they sort of parallel one another. The Orange Turnpike to the north, that's Ewell's 2nd Corps, and the Orange Plank Road to the south, and that's A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps. And so what's shaping up here is actually going to be two separate battles. Warren was ordered to attack and stop Ewell's troops as they advanced up the turnpike. When General Meade learned that rebel infantry was approaching his right flank, he at first dismissed it as just a division of strength force, not a full corps, when in fact it was the entire Confederate 2nd Corps. As the U.S. 6th Corps emerges from the woods to face off against Ewell's Confederates, the rebels fired on Warren's men from behind earthworks that they had fashioned. Meade directed Sedgwick's 6th Corps to Warren's right to basically guarantee that the rebels couldn't envelop that flank, Warren's flank, but all they really accomplished was to broaden the front. Meanwhile, Warren learned from Union cavalry that A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps was moving up the Orange Plank Road towards the Brock Road intersection, which, if they reached it and held it, would present Meade with a very serious problem. If Hill's men gained possession of the intersection at Brock Road, they could basically split the two Union Army corps of infantry. To stave off this disaster, General Meade ordered a division of Sedgwick's 6th Corps, commanded by George Getty, to pass behind Warren's corps, so the Confederates couldn't see it happening, take up a blocking position along the Orange Plank and Brock Road intersections, and then to wait for General Hancock's 2nd Corps, the Union, to return from Todd Tavern. With both the left and right wings of the Federal and Rebel armies separated from each other by about a mile, two separate battles began to develop. Both sides hastily built log and earthen breastworks and fortifications, and the night brought exhaustion. Thousands of dead and wounded lay in and around the wilderness. The next day, May the 6th, Longstreet's two divisions finally arrive along the Orange Plank Road to reinforce A.P. Hill's battered 3rd Corps. Longstreet had General Kershaw's South Carolina division on the right side of the Orange Plank Road and General Fields' division on the left. Kershaw's division wheeled south and drove the Union troops beyond their frontline entrenchments, while the leading unit of Fields' division, the Texas Brigade, swung north across a clearing on the edge of the wilderness and attacked Hancock's Second Corps. The Texans stopped 3 Union brigades cold, but at a terrible cost. In just 10 minutes, half of them had been killed or wounded. Lee took a moment during a lull in the fight to converse with General Longstreet about what their next move ought to be. And resorting to his Napoleonic fighting ethos, Lee abandoned Longstreet's counsel, which was to conduct a flanking attack, and instead Lee orders a frontal assault to break the Union center. He did the same thing with Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, and that didn't work out so well. And so Lee orders a frontal assault to break the Union center at Brock Road, a tactic, again, reminiscent of the failed Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. The Union had regrouped and were ready for the Confederate suicide charge and opened up with canister shot, the unwelcome messenger. Charging into withering musketry fire and cannon fire, and basically swept the area clear in front of them, the Confederates dropped to the ground 30 yards from the works, the Union breastworks, and began to fire back. And when that happened, several parts of the forest began to catch on fire because of the intense firefight. Bursting shells, flailing bullets ignited the woods, and immediately south of the crossroads. And wounded men, unfortunately, burned to death. Many did, as the fire and the smoke reached their positions. After the rebel attack on Hancock's Brock Road intersection was beaten back, Lee again pressed Ewell's Second Corps, stationed at the turnpike, to do something. A plan was hatched to try and turn the Union right when the sun went down. So late in the day, Gordon and his Georgians finally received permission to attack the Union's dangling right flank, part of John Sedgwick's Sixth Corps. And General Gordon led an attack at about 7 o'clock that evening, the evening of May the 6th, which yielded some results, but the darkness eventually brought an end to the operations, the fighting, and the 2-day Battle of the Wilderness ended. The battle had cost the Union around 18,000 men, and the Confederates about 11,000. And it marked the first direct confrontation of the war between Grant and Lee. Each man learned a lot about the other during that Battle of the Wilderness. So while it was a tactical draw, the Wilderness was a strategic triumph for Grant, because when the fighting ended, Grant retained the initiative. In the span of 3 days, the war in the East had changed irrevocably. It was the major turning point of the war. Not only that, Grant surprised everyone by doing something no other Union general had done following the end of a Union battle, and that was he advanced. On the evening of May the 7th, Grant surprised his men. He rode up to their position on his horse as they were marching along the Brock Road, and informed them all that they were marching to Richmond and there would be no going back. Wild cheers echoed through the forest as Union soldiers threw their hats in the air, tossed up their arms, clapped, and pressed as close as they could to try to touch Grant, clapping their hands, speaking to him with the familiarity of comrades. "On to Richmond!" they shouted. Pine knots and leaves were set on fire and lighted the scene with the flickering glare, wrote one of Grant's aides. The night march had become a triumphal procession for the new commander. So we're now going to cover the second major battle of the Overland Campaign, the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, which was fought from May the 8th to May the 21st, 1864. And so I'm going to stop it here because that coverage for that battle is fairly lengthy, and I don't want to expend too much time on this video with that. So as soon as I can figure out how to stop this, I'll stop it.